Hello, Bede. This is Hal, and I'm here again with Bede, my friend and fellow Vedanta student. Bede's in Australia. I'm speaking over the internet with him today from California, and we're continuing our talks about what Bede calls Vedanta Psychology. This is the 5th video in a series. So how are you doing today, Bede?
Yeah, very good. Thanks very much, Hal. I think what we'll do is I just want to sum up with what we've been sort of talking about. Now, I think the most remarkable thing about Swami Dayananda is, in terms of his psychology, is this. He has practically clarified what the nature and the structure of human suffering actually is, in such a way that we can not only actually recognize that what it is in our life, and at the same time what he's done is he's clarified the structure and the nature of what the resolution of that specific suffering is. And it's quite an achievement, really, and it changes the way we see this whole area. And what we've been talking about, and this is the distinction between what we call subjectivity, which is all our suffering always involves subjectivity. All our psychological suffering always involves subjectivity. When we're happy, or when we have a clear mind, and when at any one moment, right here, right now, as I am, when I am what he calls objective, I am relatively free from the subjectivity, which makes me relatively free from the suffering, which has a direct impact on what we would call human well-being. And so what been talking about so far is we've been looking at the nature and structure of subjectivity. And I just want to briefly go over that again. Have you got anything to add to that, Hal?
No, that sounds good. Could you maybe, going back a little bit, could you define what do you mean exactly by subjectivity?
Right. What we talked about was that fundamentally, as a human being, we have a sense of self-dissatisfaction. We actually have an idea of ourselves that we don't like. So we say, I'm a bit of a loser, and then I'm upset about that idea. I'm in friction. So I'm experiencing myself. I'm having an experience of myself as a loser, or as a person who's sad, or as a person who's irritated, or as a person who is bored, and I don't like it. This fundamental, and it's based on a notion. You see, in the sense that if I think, for example, that you're an idiot, I'm not aware that I'm having a notion that you're an idiot. I'm having an experience that you are an idiot. I'm not aware of the notion. The notion as a notion is unconscious entirely. What I'm so-called conscious of is I'm having an experience of an idiot. We do the same to ourselves. We're not aware that we have a self-judgment, I'm an idiot. We're having an experience of ourself as an idiot, and then we're upset about that experience.
Now, how do we know that that's subjective, though, and that isn't actually true?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Remember what we talked about in the third talk is that if me being an idiot was intrinsic to me, that actually belonged to who I was, it would never go into suspension. It would never be set aside.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the important thing here in our life, practically speaking, is this. When we're caught in subjectivity, the experience is completely objective. We actually believe, because I see it, it's there. We're not aware of that mechanism happening. As far as we're concerned, when we're dramatizing subjectivity, we are completely right, and we are seeing the world as it is. Have you noticed that when you're upset with someone, you feel incredibly right?
Sure, yeah.
And this is one of the main problems with subjectivity, is that we, in one sense, justify it.
So what you're saying, is that is based on. It sounds like what you're saying is that based on a passing emotional state that we're having,
Mm-hmm.
not feeling good about myself right now, or I'm feeling irritated with you right now, whatever it may be,
Mm-hmm.
then that's how I'm actually seeing things. And that's subjective. Now we can tell it's subjective and not the way things really are, because in an hour, in 2 days, or in 2 weeks, I may see you and I'm not feeling irritated. You may have done something very nice for me, and suddenly I think, well, Bede is quite a good fellow. He's really a nice guy, and he's actually quite smart. He has good taste, and so on and so forth. Whereas at the moment, I kind of feel you're a fool because I'm a little upset with something about you. Or I could say the same thing about myself. So the fact that these states change, and based on our states changing, the way we perceive reality changes. When we become aware of that, we can see that actually we're being subjective.
Yes, but we need a way to recognize it before that. That's why it's important to understand the structure of subjectivity, what is always present and involved. And what that is friction. So that when I'm in any form of psychological friction, when I am a resistor,
mm-hmm.
battling with a resisted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at in terms of ourselves, have you ever beat yourself up a bit? Have you ever felt bad about yourself, Hal?
Yes, I have.
Right. So that involves you as a person who's upset with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's always the resistor and the resisted. So we need to know the structure so that at any one moment we can go, oh, I'm now caught in subjectivity. So, for example, with people, the factor of enmity, and Swami Dayananda explains this extremely well, because we've had experiences of being hurt by people, what happens is that we do have a desire to pay them back. We have enmity towards others that comes out, this hostility, because we've been hurt, we want to pay people back. This is why we take such delight in one sense in getting angry and irritated with others. We're not aware of that, but the fact is that, have you seen that human beings tend to, at the drop of a hat, become full of enmity towards their fellow human beings?
Yeah, it seems to be quite a widespread problem. Just look at the news every day, for example.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that even though that happens so often, what is not seen as the actual underlying hurt?
Mm-hmm.
You see, the hurt, Swami Dayananda would say the hurt, which is unconscious, because when you're busy being angry and hateful, if you don't feel hurt, you feel strong. That defends us against the hurt. So when we attack others, have you seen people in offices attacking others and talking behind people's backs and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Mm-hmm.
That type of thing is the dramatization of subjectivity in the form of anger, but the basis of that hostility is hurt. Have you ever seen people be righteously judgmental about others and how or their faults, and indignant about how people are not good enough or not sensitive enough, or how can you believe they could act this way? Have you seen that kind of thing, Hal?
Just listen to talk radio for about 5 minutes.
Right. Now, that is guilt, because we've done things that are a little bit naughty, that don't fit well with us. We're accumulated guilt. We're driven to find judgment against other people, because then when we're seeing defects in others, we feel glowingly good. We feel glowingly free of defects. So it's absolutely important to be able to, at any one time, remember when we talked at the first talk, that basically the practice of Vedanta is right here, right near, as I am. So,
but Bede, let me ask you a question. I think we've touched on this before, but I think what you're getting at is that there's a way for us to see when we're being subjective without having to even necessarily go through a whole analysis of looking at our changing states over time. That is a way that we can see how subjective we are, but actually how do we see it in this very moment? How do we catch ourselves being subjective? And what you indicated is through the experience of friction. So, and I think we may have talked a little about this before, but maybe I need a little more clarification about it. Why is it that when everyone is experiencing friction, one is being subjective. Isn't friction just a part of life? Sometimes one feels friction.
Okay, now we're talking about the psychological friction of resisting facts.
Mm-hmm.
Resisting facts. Now, you bring up a very interesting point. We can't really understand what subjectivity is unless we have a very clear idea of what it is to be objective, because otherwise there is no contrast. That's what we're going to be going into next, actually. We have to thoroughly understand what it means to be objective, not as an idea, because then we can see when we shifted away from that. Now, Swami Dayananda's got a very interesting thing, is that when we're alive to facts, there is no friction. There may be something to be done, of course, to respond. But when we're disturbed, when we're in friction, when we're upset about something, you see, always that is that right here, right now, as I am, I notice that I am disturbed. In other words, I'm disturbed maybe about myself. I've done something stupid and I go, oh my God, how can I act that way? You know what I mean? Or someone has done something I don't like. That's pretty much an everyday occurrence, isn't it, Hal? People doing things we don't like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we all experience that.
Yes, and situations being to what we're not. And we've talked about the fact that what happens is that we have this fundamental pain, this agony, this angst about ourselves. We then try and set up our life so we don't have to experience this angst. And every time, and out of this angst comes desires for certain things to be in certain ways. They're called binding desires because they bind us. And then when we have the experience of things not being the way we are, the binding desire becomes frustrated. We're thrown back on our angst and we're upset. Right. And then we're in friction. Now, there's two ways we're going to deal with this. The usual way is to try and change ourselves, try and change other people, or try and change the world. That's the usual way we try to make ourselves feel right again. And we know this. When you have an argument with your spouse, have you noticed that sometimes you really want to just talk to them to get them to change their position so you can feel right again? Have you ever had that experience?
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, this actually shows, first of all, our dependence upon others for our sense of rightness. Does that make sense? In the light of Vedanta, it is not that your wife has upset you and she's the cause of it. In the light of Vedanta, all she's done is she's been instrumental in revealing a fundamental self-dissatisfaction that you have in yourself. And
yes, it's interesting how that works. Even sometimes over seemingly small things, when you disagree with a friend about, let's say, whether a movie was good or not. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but one can start to feel disturbed. Why should that bother me at all? There's no good reason. I have my opinion, he has his, but for some reason, it seems that it touches upon some kind of a doubt about yourself that you have.
That's a very good point, Hal. We're constantly being triggered.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is happenings happening in our life, and these happenings trigger us, and then we become aware of ourselves as unhappy in some way, irritated, bored, frustrated, or whatever. Now, once we understand that this is subjectivity, that what I'm suffering from is subjectivity, what is the solution? If I really clearly see that I'm suffering from a way of seeing in which there is dualism, you know how they talk about, when people talk about that they like Advaita, which means non-dualism.
Yes.
I'm very interested in a way of life that involves non-dualism. Mm-hmm. You see, normally we're caught up in dualism. This psychological friction is a dualism, isn't it? It's the division or friction between me as a resistor and the resisted.
Right. This is important. I think what you're saying is because some people might say, well, what is the point of this dualism and non-dualism? Who cares? But really, what Vedanta is meant to address is that from dualism comes suffering, right? As long as there's this kind of dualistic relationship or understanding. It's like me versus you, me versus the world. Either we're in friction with each other, or there's something about the other that is causing me fear or distress in some fashion or another. So that's the problem with dualism, and this is why we're interested in non-dualism. But one thing that you said that I thought was very interesting a little bit earlier is that to really understand the dualism, or the friction, the psychological friction that we're frequently, if not always, most of us experiencing, you have to have a contrast. In a sense, you have to have some sense of what it is to be without that friction. And I think this goes back, it reminded me of early on when we started our conversation several videos again, and you were talking about that basic sense of just being a conscious being. For example, like when you're in nature or in a situation where you're not being threatened by anything, and at least for a moment you experience some kind of a gap in the stormy weather, so to speak, of your mind, and you feel just okay with yourself and with the world as it is.
Now, this is a very interesting point, Hal. It is not possible to understand and appreciate subjectivity really until we become thoroughly familiar with what it means to be objective.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I'm dealing with now is a primary foundation, if you like, for spiritual practice in Vedanta in terms of preparation. Mm-hmm. In the sense that without understanding what objectivity is and then abiding in that objectivity on a daily basis, there is no possibility that our life can be transformed. All we can have is modification of subjectivity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what we're looking at here is this. Right now, right here, as I am, I find myself distressed. Because I have a certain understanding now, I understand that the distress, the problem is me, not my spouse or situations or my mind. Now, what if we could, because of our understanding, right now, right here, as I am, actually right where I am, shift into being objective? In other words, right here, right now, as I am, I'm not changing from subjectivity to objectivity. I'm not changing the subjectivity. I'm actually just simply leaving all I want to do with the subjectivity is to recognize it. But what I do is I as a person become objective. Now this is the key to our practice when it comes to what Dayananda calls emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is becoming what he means by objective. And also what he means by objective is that when you are objective, in fact, what happens is that you are secure, you're composed, and you have a well-being, which is no longer dependent upon your mind, other people, or things. And that's the direction that we're going.
Well, that seems like a very good direction to be going, Bede. How do we get there? That's
okay.
Now, yeah.
This is why. So first of all, this is why it's so important to understand what is. You see, there's an epistemological rule that means to do with knowing. Mm-hmm. You can't, if you kind of know what, you know how. It's a strange thing. If I know what objectivity is, I can be objective. See, it's not like a doing in a sense. Do you know what I mean? With an act of will, I'm going to decide to be objective. It's more because I understand and know, I recognize, I see the meaning. What does it mean for me to be objective? And so you want to say something, Hal?
No, I'd just like you to say a little bit more about that.
Okay. Now, so what we're going to do is now we've looked at the structure of subjectivity. We looked at the fact that often my experience is fragmented and broken into the objector and the resistor and the resisted. There's dualism. Now, what we want to discover is non-dualism psychologically. Now, we're not talking about the absolute dualism that Vedanta eventually deals with, which is the dualism between myself as an individual and the whole. We're talking about the psychological dualism, the basis of human suffering.
So you're saying you were not at this point yet addressing this fundamental oneness with the whole that Vedanta is leading us to eventually, or that is the real goal, the point of Vedanta. But just initially, as a preparatory matter, learning to deal with our psychological conflict with life, to overcome that sort of dualism on a more psychological level.
Unless the individual knows what it is to be relatively objective, Swami Dayananda says it's impossible to understand absolute objectivity. Absolutely impossible.
Because you're caught up too much in struggle with everything.
And you won't really know what you're there. Now, it was a very interesting thing. Someone asked Swami Dayananda a question once, and they said to him, what's the purpose of life? Mm-hmm. And he said, the purpose of life is to live, which is pretty basic. But then he said a very interesting thing. He said, what does it mean to live? What does it mean? So here I am, I'm living, and we think, well, what do you mean, what does it mean to live? You know what I mean? The fact of the matter is, in his eyes, often we're not actually living, in fact. We're dramatizing subjectivity, which is not living. And so what he says is, to live is to be alive to facts. Now, that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? That what he's saying is, and he said that normally we live a life of a sleepwalker. That we're caught up in our subjectivity, we're caught up in our habitual routines that protect us from the self-dissatisfaction, and we're just caught up in reaction. Right. So we're now going to look at what it means to live, which is the same as what it means to be objective, which is the same as what it means to be relatively happy.
Okay.
Now, remember when we were talking about, and we're going to go into this slowly, but remember when we were talking about when we find ourselves out in the bush. And what happens is that the most fundamental thing about life is that reality is in the form of cars. The presence of reality is in the form of cars, or the presence of reality is in the form of trees, and the presence of reality is in the form of thoughts and ideas, and the presence of reality is in the form of other people. The presence of reality is in the form of parks. You see, so the thing is that reality is present, isn't it, in these various forms. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's present in basically whatever it is that we're experiencing.
Exactly. So the happening in our life is the presence in reality in the form of that particular happening. Now, Is this presence of reality, is that an abstract notion?
No, it's very real.
Is it a philosophy?
No, it's actually in a sense, the texture of our lives day to day. Exactly.
So right here is the presence of reality in the form of me and you talking, right here, right now, right here, and as I am. Okay, right. It includes the total picture, doesn't it?
Yes.
So now, what happens is that when we're out in the bush, we find ourselves being aware. So we find that the presence of the trees and the sounds of the birds takes up all the room in our mind, don't we?
When we can drop all of our self-preoccupation.
Yeah, normally we don't drop it. It's sort of actually like what you mentioned before. It's sort of mainly accidental, isn't it?
It's accidental, right.
It's accidental, but we suddenly find ourselves full of the presence of reality.
Right.
Now, but an interesting thing happens then. The resistor, the person who resists, me as a resistor, I disappear as a resistor. I'm no longer having an experience, I'm resisting.
Right.
All I find is I'm an awareful presence, full of the presence of reality.
Yes.
Now, isn't it interesting that I find myself, because the presence of reality comes in and takes up all the room in my mind, I suddenly find myself as a conscious individual.
Yes.
And it's not because I'm deciding to be aware. It's because I have a certain relation to the presence of reality in the form of what is happening. Because I'm abiding in a relation. In other words, I'm receiving what is there. Basically what happens is that my mind, me, I'm receiving simply what is there, and what is there takes up all the room, and then I find the suffering self that I often experience myself to be isn't there.
Right, right. And this sort of happens to us. It's not that we're doing anything, so to speak, to make it happen.
No.
It's only that we find ourselves in this place, whether we are wandering into the woods or into a beautiful canyon. It's as if we've suddenly walked into a beautiful temple or church or some kind of an environment in which our consciousness is just filled by the environment that we're in.
Yes, we're full of objects. We're objective.
Yeah, okay, that's the meaning of that word, I see. Right.
Okay? We're full of objects. So we're objective. Now, there's a very interesting thing here. We want to understand what this means. You know how I said that Vedanta is all about analyzing experiences?
Yes.
So we find that when we are objective, in other words, when what is happening takes up all the room and there's no resistance to what is happening, I become right in myself, psychologically.
Right.
Now, this is a profound insight that I can't stress how important this is, because when we understand the meaning of objectivity, it means that, you see, it's okay to be objective. It's easy to be objective, as I've said, with birds and trees. This is how I started. When I started to become familiar with objectivity, I would go for walks and I would dwell on and abide in this relation to what is, to reality, the presence of reality in the form of trees and birds, until I become very familiar with it. That's true.
Right.
But we want to be able to understand it, because the whole point is that in life, if we are objective, we can see what's in front of us. And we're not talking about being kind of like, oh, I'm just going to be nice and passive.
Right.
The basis of responsiveness is seeing what's in front of you.
Right. You can't always just be in the forest with birds and trees every minute of your life. So this is just a way to maybe, for you at work, to help you get familiar with this basic attitude or response to life.
Right.
Allowing life, the experience of life, to just fill your mind, to fill your consciousness.
Right.
And then experiencing yourself as really just an awareful or conscious being.
A conscious being, yes. So what's important is, you see, Swami Dayananda always starts with the trees and the birds when he talks about his lectures and, you know, all of that stuff, right? But what we want is, we want to be objective in front of various mental reactions that gets triggered. We want to learn to be objective in front of the actions of other people, even actions that are unpleasant. And we want to be objective with situations.
Right. Well, see, because what's important here is what this experience, so to speak, reveals about yourself.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You see, we're looking at the meaning of what it is to be objective. And the thing is, we've had moments where we're objective, but we haven't seen what that means.
Mm-hmm.
You see, the teaching of Vedanta shows clearly what that means. And you see, once we know what it means, we can shift into it.
Right, because it's once you recognize that this is who you actually are, then that's a recognition that's always there. It's always available to you because it's who you are and you're always there.
Yes. So what happens is, and there's this big difference. When I'm objective, I'm the same. When I'm subjective, what's happening is I'm happy one moment, confused the next moment, daydreaming the next moment. I'm chopping and changing. I'm having highs and lows.
Yeah.
But you see, when we're objective, we can meet all happenings with what they call a sameness of mind. You see, and this is what he means by yoga. In the Gita, this is what they mean by yoga. And yoga is basically the transformation of the individual in order to be able to understand the vision.
Oh, so this is interesting. This is the kind of sameness of mind, or in a sometimes equanimity, you might say, that yoga is meant to cultivate. But when we think of yoga, we always think of something rather fancy and exotic.
Yeah.
But what we're really talking about is something that's very natural to us when we're being objective.
Yes, and you see the whole point with once objectivity has been discovered, what happens is that no matter what happens, reality happens as it happens. Have you noticed that, Hal? It just happens the way it happens. Events happen the way they happen.
Right.
And the thing is if we can, and they come in two, success, failure, pleasant, unpleasant, all of this. If we can remain ourselves without getting caught up in our psychological reactions, this practice is called karma yoga.
I see.
But it's absolutely important. You see, we use our will because like my teacher makes big stresses. We have to make efforts, but it's not trying to become something. It's not trying to become a better idea of myself. It's deliberately abiding in a relation to the whole, to what is happening right now, right here as I am, in which I am being objective. So it's a relation to the whole. You see, normally our relation is characterized by friction, agreed? This is a relation in which there is graceful acceptance. There's more to this. So I just want to add, there's a lot more to this objectivity, but I just want to get the structure of objectivity. When I, as an individual, are filled with the presence of what is, and I am not resisting it, I am objective. That's why we've got to go in a bit later, but to deal with the resistance. But I just want to at the moment look at the structure of objectivity. When I am being objective, the presence of what is happening fills up all my mind, and there is no resistance, psychological resistance. There may be reactions about that. You do something I don't like, I also dislike it. That's also a fact to be awake to, isn't it? So we're talking about being objective means to include everything. What's happening, plus my reactions to what's happening. The key here is not becoming the reactions.
Right. So what is the effort involved in this that you were referring to?
Well, I won't go into that just right now, but what we're talking about here is this. Given that, this is just the preparation for, we'll deal with that next one. Given that we understand that we recognize that my wife said something I don't like and I feel myself being a little bit negative. Or I'm walking down the road. When I started doing this, I'll be walking down the road and I just noticed I was just a little bit off. Do you know, have you ever been walking down the road and just feel a little bit, right?
Yeah, sure.
Now, once we understand this fact of objectivity and subjectivity, we see that event in a different way. We see that as an opportunity. Now, here's a revelation of my fundamental self-dissatisfaction. And the whole purpose of karma yoga is to neutralize the binding desires that come from that self-dissatisfaction, like going outwards, going out towards people and things in order to fix it. And so what we're looking at is fundamentally impacting on the angst. So this is an opportunity to resolve the angst right now, right here as we are. And the repeated practice of this, what it does, it unburdens the mind. It unburdens us because we now have access to the problem and the solution is always objectivity. So the solution to subjectivity is objectivity. So we're no longer looking at, oh, I'm all screwed up or I'm pathetic. We simply see our problem is that we're living in our own world. Now, Swami Dayananda's got a very interesting point here. He says we're living in our own world. We're enclosed in our own world. We're full of me. And he said we've got to be less of me and more of reality. We've got to live in the world of reality and less in the world of me.
So we're kind of giving ourselves over to reality in a certain way.
We're basically have an openness so that we receive reality into our life, the presence of reality, which we're going to go into what that means later. There's more to this. But when we find ourselves receiving the presence of reality into our life, and it takes up all the room, the most meaningful thing about this is it completely displaces the subjectivity. In other words, all the suffering collapses. Then that neutralizes the binding desires at this moment, right now, right here as I am. And I keep doing this repeatedly. This is the practice, but we'll go into that next time. But all I wanted to just to make clear today is that we can become, not only can we understand what objectivity is and that we can recognize it, but we can then practice abiding in it once we've recognized what it is. And there's a lot more to this because we've got to deal with this fundamental thing of resistance. But all I wanted to clarify today was that when we are objective, we are full of the presence of reality in the form that it is happening without resistance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Bede.
Okay, so what we're going to do next time, so just to sum up, there is a relation to the whole, whatever is happening, that is available right now, right here as I am. And this relation is a possible, we can discover this relation and we can abide in it at any time. And when we learn to abide in it, particularly when we're upset or angry or whatever, what happens is right here, right now, as I am, the subjectivity is resolved through being objective. And being objective means to be psychologically secure, composed, and full or have well-being. Okay?
Sounds great. Thank you. Very good.
Okay.
All right, I look forward to talking to you again next time then.
Okay, thanks very much, Hal.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.